Welcome back to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry. And of course, that different thumbnail attached to the podcast and the different music attached is because this is a literature series of the Korea Now podcast, which is going to run throughout the summer. And also the reason why I'm so happy to have today's guest on the podcast, Frank Rausch. Frank is an associate professor of history at Landa University, as well as being the author of the book Catholics and Anti-Catholicism in Choson Korea. But because this is a literature series of the podcast, today we're going to focus on Frank's translation of an old Choson tale, which is the story of Changhwa and Hongnyon. It's a tale that is best translated and often is translated as the Korean Cinderella story. It first dates back to the 17th century, and of course over time the story changes, is embellished, new elements are added and subtracted. And then of course in the Japanese colonial period it revives itself again and becomes something really central to Korean identity. This is a time when novels are booming, the printing technology is booming as well. But also Koreans are looking for romantic tales about the past and independent stories, opportunities for fantasy and ways to escape the suffering of everyday life. And importantly, a tale of morality in which evil is punished and good is rewarded. And in some ways this is that tale, just as in some ways it's not. This does have a lot of similarities with Cinderella, but there's also a lot of peculiarities to it as well. Running through so much of it is the importance of filial duty, the importance of marriage and good standing within society, of bloodlines and lineage and inheritance, of conservative values and the old structures of society. And just as all good fairy tales do, at so many turns within this story there is a moral lesson, and often an explicit moral lesson, pushed before the reader. This is one of those interesting stories that hasn't just changed over time, but has been a part of a certain modern revival, built into TV shows and movies, and rediscovered in the modern era, with many aspects of the tale itself still applying in certain ways today. And I'm going to be conscious here in this introduction not to give too much of the story away, beyond that very brief context and cultural setting which I've done there. Because of course in this podcast Frank will go through it in detail, explore the story at each turn and pause and analyze the context, the history, the significant detail, and certainly the moral structures that are being presented. And of course Frank's translation, editing and analysis is going to be linked below and easily accessible online free of charge. So I do encourage listeners to go and read it for themselves. It will give you not just an interesting look into the tale itself, but into the period and ideas of Korean life and Korean national identity. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. We've made a conscious decision here on the Korea Now podcast not to run advertising in any way. So if you listen to the podcast and you like it and you do want it to continue, it is important that you support the podcast at the Patreon or PayPal links attached below. Failing that, it is always important that you share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And all the help in this regard is really important. On that, and to walk us through the story of Changhwa and Hongnyon, this is Frank Rausch. Frank Rausch, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So I was really hoping to get you on during this literature series because you've done this really interesting translation and analysis of this, an old Choson text which has much deeper implications and has these implications for so many things. And before we jump into that, I might get you to introduce yourself and why this particular text was so important to you and why you translated it and did the work on it.
I teach at a little university in South Carolina, and it's a very much a teaching institution. So, we teach like a 4-4 load, so a good amount of classes. And so a lot of times my research agenda kind of follows my teaching agenda. And I was asked to teach an honors class on popular culture in East Asia. And that's kind of a side of mine. I'm a historian by training. I focus on religion. And so I was just trying to think about, good things to put in it. It was very broad because it was East Asia as a whole, so I could kind of pick and choose what I wanted to include. And I like horror movies. I'm a big fan of the genre, but more of the ghost story, supernatural stories I enjoy. And maybe there's some, because it connects to religion, which is, I tend to focus on the history of religion. And so what happened then was I was teaching this honors class, and I thought, I remembered that I liked that movie, The Two Sisters, Changhwa Hongnyon, right, in Korean, and I wanted to show them the movie, And then I showed it to them for one iteration of the class. The students were really into it. They were into the mystery, the ghost story, and all that stuff. And I was like, I really need to translate this so the students can read it. So I can't remember what edition I used, but I just found, I think it was just one on the internet. And I put together a very rough translation, had a friend help, or a former student of mine, Sujin Lee, help me to kind of double check me. I enjoyed hearing your interview with Dr. Ross King, and you talked about, whether you needed a partner in translation, right? A fluent speaker in both. And I really respect people who don't need one, but I certainly am not one of them. I definitely need a Korean usually to double check me. So we were able to do that, and they enjoyed it. The students really enjoyed kind of comparing the original story with the movie. And so that's how I kind of fell into this. Okay, so let's jump into the text itself. So this is the story of Changhwa and Hongnyon. And let's go back to the very origins of this story. This is quite an old Choson tale itself. And interestingly, you write here that it's based on real events, though, of course, horribly embellished over the years, as you might expect. Right, yeah. No, I mean, yeah, that's very true. This was a kind of a murder mystery, I believe, that was solved by a magistrate, and then it was written about by Chun Tong-hul, and he gets the basic kind of account down, and then it's embellished to include these supernatural elements, but also, and I think this is one thing I kind of enjoyed about it, was the supernatural elements are used to teach a moral, and I tend to enjoy didactic literature, so. And the element that runs through this, and you put it in your introduction, and I've heard this myself living in Korea, that this is a Korean version of Cinderella. So I might get opened up that particular part of the story. Right. I mean, I think that's always, we talk about blended families, I mean, as if they were something new, but of course they're not. In pre-modern societies, it was very common for people to die early, especially women were vulnerable, I think, through childbirth and through other issues. So it was, in the past, remarriage was quite common. And of course, you have this issue that, that you have a new husband or new wife coming in the household. In both those stories, right, it's a new wife, and that's going to maybe cause conflict with the children, right? And especially when the issue of inheritance comes up. And that's a very important element of this story. But yeah, I think there is that kind of trope of the evil stepmother, and it's not always fair to the stepmother, right? And that's one thing that's kind of unfair to poor Mrs. Huh in this story. Is of course she's just this evil villainess, and is just apparently has just always been a terrible person. We know because she's so ugly, right? I mean, that's how she's presented, and they make it very clear that there's just something very evil about her. Well, let's jump into that for a second, because that was one of the interesting parts here. As you say, there's a lot of moral statements being dragged out through this, but the appearance of Mrs. Ho, which is the new stepwife of the husband after the first wife dies, this goes on for almost a paragraph of just labeling her appearance. It's not a pass off as she's ugly. Her cheeks, her eyes, her nose, her lips, her hair, everything gets a mention here, and a comparison to an animal of sorts. So, and this, I'm assuming, is to imply a moral failing on the human being inside. Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. Like, I'm just looking at it because, her lips were like those of a catfish, her hair like that of a pig. Her voice was like that of a wolf. And I think that's especially interesting that they keep bringing up this idea of a wolf-like voice. But yeah, there's this idea that she is just rotten to the core and has always been that way. And so it's kind of a tension, I think, in the story, because they say, I think 2 or maybe 3 times, this is a warning to us that you should treat all your children, or if you come into a household, treat the children that were already there nicely. That it implies a kind of moral choice. Like, people can choose to be good or bad, but Miss Hud just appears to have always been rotten. Yes. So let's step into the tale itself and the details of it, and start. And as you mentioned, interestingly, you spend a lot of your time as a professor of religion, and it starts with a religious overtone. At least it sounded like that to me, of a husband and a wife before the death of the wife.
and she's looking to get pregnant. And it begins with heaven being involved. A fairy comes down, enters her bosom. And this happens at the beginning and at the end as well. It's almost like a divine birth. I'm not sure how you saw that.
Right. No, I think you're right. And I mean, isn't that the Kim Hong-dong? I always forget the exact name, but the Korean Robin Hood, right? It's the same kind of thing. It's just this idea that there is we live in a moral universe, and that heaven is essentially benevolent and will take care of us. And if things go wrong, eventually heaven will see things right if we're sincere. Just kind of looking back to it, it's kind of curious why heaven picks this family, since Muryong's not the husband's not that impressive.
Yes.
Of a person, though I guess he is in a way sincere. But I guess it's Mrs. Chong, his wife, who has the dream. So, and she appears to be a very, very good woman, right? I mean, when she really cares for her children, and it's her family that she's concerned about as she lays dying. So maybe it's, in a sense, these are good people, and heaven kind of looked after them. But also, of course, it's interesting that heaven gives them daughters but no son.
Yes, and sorry, go.
Oh no, go ahead.
No, and I was actually going to say that imposition there, that idea of waiting for birth and all these things, it has a certain amount of. What I'm trying to do is brings back to that stepmother question that you first mentioned at the start there, because it seems to have been a very significant problem in the world. Now, we may not think of it today, but you have to assume back then, in a different time, in all cultures, that the idea of a mother dying, this is how the story starts, and the mother's dying, and she's terrified of what's going to happen to her two daughters, because she fully expects her husband to remarry. And when she expects her husband to remarry, she expects these two stepdaughters to be horribly treated. And this seems to be a theme. And as you mentioned there at the start as well, it runs through in the sense that there's moral lessons here throughout, saying this is a lesson for everyone. Treat your stepdaughters and sons well. Right.
And I think, and I don't believe I got this in the introduction, and this reflects my my lack of skill when it comes to literary culture. But it reminds me I think one of the books I was reading for background of this talked about how this kind of happens in a patriarchal culture, because the man exercises so much power that there's going to be this competition for his favor. And so that the stepmother coming in sees the daughters as competition.
So that competition, is it? Yeah, I'm assuming so too. And I have to guess that a lot of it, what does come through a lot of this, and of course it must be a reflection of those times as well, is the inheritance, the fear that, of course, the woman who dies, who is the upstanding moral character, the first wife, she owns a lot of land, and the stepmother that comes in, who is ugly, of course, and morally failed, she simply wants to claim the land that these two daughters' mother had for themselves.
Right. And the overseer, I remember, reminds her of that at one point.
Yes.
Says, what you eat was originally all my former wife's property. Don't harm these young ones. Don't be mean to them. But that didn't work. He does try to gently reason with her. But how can a greedy and ruthless woman change her ways? Not very Confucian, I think, right? You should be able to change.
Not very Confucian, but it does have a lot of almost karmic elements to it, in a sense that there is a lot of times people are dying in this story. And every time someone dies, there's always the statement of they must have done something horrible in their past life.
Right. And I think I find that really fascinating, because I guess that's a way that you can explain why the person dies in a good moral universe while keeping the character a good person. So it's not the mother's fault that she's dying in this life. It was something she did in her past life. But right now she's good. She's just got to pay off that karmic debt. So I think it preserves her character, if that makes sense.
Yes. So let's jump into some of the details of the story then, and let's begin to step this out. So the household begins. The husband marries. They have two children. The wife dies, and then the stepmother eventually moves into the house with her three sons, and she begins to. She's had enough of this at some point, and she wants to get rid of the two daughters. And she does it by, again, an act of the times, but something that for many people today might be strange. She fakes an abortion for one of the daughters, and this is a death sentence. Automatically, in the eyes of this kind father, this is a death sentence.
Right. Yeah, it's really kind of shocking. And I guess a lot of it, I thinking about it, I wonder how much of it has to do with that idea that, in a sense, it's like disloyalty to a king, right? That she was sneaking around with another man rather than her father, right? And doing something she wasn't supposed to, and that would bring shame on the family. And so they're just going to get rid of her, and they're going to do it secretly so that no one has to know of their shame, right? This idea of sending her off to the uncle. I think that's what's going on here. But yeah, he's very, very upset about this.
And there's an element in a lot of this, it seems, of inherited moral values, because the son of the stepmother is the one who is charged with killing the daughter. And
right.
Again, in the text, he's talked about having a pig-like nose and things like this. And he's blind to the morals behind it. He simply obeys his mother and doesn't think.
Right. Yeah. It's this idea of heredity, and I don't know if there's also some karma in there too. And yeah, the thing that I also think is weird is, why did the overseer marry this woman with the
yes.
It's always this thing. It's like they talk about how ugly she was, and it's like, there were no other women here? Like,
and with no inheritance, no money, none of the other things that ordinarily would have mattered back then.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of a curious thing.
Yes.
But yeah, again, this is another person who is completely morally reprehensible, who does not care about, that he's going to murder this woman that, his stepsister, who's known for a long time. He's not bothered at all by that. Sorry, go on.
Let's talk about an element of that in some ways, which is this the representation of nature throughout the text. And nature, in many ways, comes across as this as a moral guide in so many ways. So as the daughter is killed by the stepson, a tiger then emerges, and this tiger attacks and maims the stepson. But in multiple times throughout the text, some part of nature, a bird or an ant or a tiger or a dragon appears, and this is like the moral guide that when people see it, they know exactly what it is. This is from heaven. This is not just an ordinary animal, and this is to rectify some earthly immorality that has happened.
Right. What's striking, and I'm looking for the exact words, because the tiger talks.
Yes.
And your mother plotted against an innocent child and killed her. Did you really think heaven would be indifferent to such evil? And then the tiger ran down Changhwa and ate his ears and one of his arms and legs. So it's really striking to me, it's really, really trying to hiss over the head with that. But I think especially the part with the bird was my favorite. Like, that was, I just loved translating that part, and I just love the imagery of this bird that for some reason can't talk. The tiger can talk, but the bird can't. Trying to gesture to help the younger sister. But I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of things. But
no, well, let's step into that then. Let's introduce what happens after that. So the older sister is killed by the son on the order of the stepmother, and then the youngest daughter is left by herself in the house, not knowing what's happened to her eldest daughter. So yeah, I might get it. Tell us what happens after that. Tell us what builds into the story and what this bird tries to do here.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So the younger sister, Hongnyon, they really try and emphasize how this is just a kind of naive, innocent, but very pure and sincere young girl. And, her mother dies when she's like 3. And so Changhwa was the one that was taking care of her and was basically like her foster mother in that sense. And so she's just very upset about Changhwa leaving, and then, tries to figure out what's going on. And the Mrs. Hug gets very upset with her about that. And she starts to really suspect that something's wrong, right? She begins to really think, okay, maybe something's going on. And it's interesting. Let's see. She cries and weeps over her desire to see her sister again. And this is after she's figured out what's happened. So she knows that her sister has been murdered and she feels terrible. She's crying. She wants to be with her. She prays to heaven. And that's in the story. Immediately the bluebird comes to see her. Now it takes a few days, it says, but it's right after she does this prayer that the bluebird comes. It's interesting. It's after she's also stopped eating. So I guess it's this idea that she's really, really sincere. And after showing that sincerity and suffering for several days, that's when heaven intervenes and sends this bluebird to come and help her.
And in a fantastic example of the morality happening here, of course, the dead sister and the ghosts that eventually come out, which we will get to, of course, they seem a lot less concerned about the fact that the elder sister was killed than they are about the fact that they were falsely accused. As in, there's not a lot of questioning of the fact that this was a righteous punishment if, in fact, she had an abortion. But all the concern is about things like my sister was disgraced, her name was shamed, and all these kind of things. And it's got nothing to do with the fact that a father happily killed his daughter because he thought she had an abortion. Right.
No, that's really striking. And I mean, I guess it goes to the kind of filial piety that they can't accuse her, the father, right? Like later on, she specifically says, don't hurt, when it comes to punishment. She says, please don't harm my father. So I think that goes to that whole idea of filial piety and the patriarchy of the time. But yeah, it's very much about this idea of washing away the shame of what happened to them. And I'm not sure why you have that focus. I guess it's kind of, they want to rectify the social death. That's more important to them than a biological death.
Yeah, and so let's talk about a couple of things before we get into when the story gets really interesting, when the magistrate arrives and it becomes investigated. A couple of things that I noticed that kept coming up, and I'm sure you saw them too, was the repetition of I suppose odd descriptions before words. So there's every time that the first wife is spoken about, she's called a wicked woman. They can't mention her name without first giving this description, the wicked woman. And the same thing happens for when people are looking for forgiveness. They always say, "I'm an insignificant man. I'm an insignificant woman." It's as if it almost has a North Korean propaganda element to it these days, where you can't say American, you must say the American bastards and this kind of stuff. Yeah. It echoes in. It's almost trying to drill into the reader the fact that don't forget what these people are like.
Right. Well, and I think sometimes that was just a recognition of hierarchy, right? You should always kind of self-deprecate. But at the same time, when they're talking about that wicked woman. Earlier, when we were talking about this, about how she was Miss Ha was described as having like a wolf-like voice, I was thinking about how in North Korean propaganda, they'll, when they talk about the United States, they'll talk about, compare us to jackals and wolves, but they'll say basically because Americans have this jackal-like nature, they can't change. There's you can't do anything with Americans because by nature we're kind of messed up, right? Yes. I'm from the United States, but so yeah, I think that you're really onto something. And this is a moral universe that they see, and that morality impacts society, and it also, I think, emphasizes the hierarchy because, in a sense, right, whoever's on top in the hierarchy is supposed to be more moral anyway. So we have to deprecate myself, right? Like if I'm talking to someone above me, of course I'm unworthy. If I was worthy, I'd be the one on top.
Yes. There's an element, I'm sure you must have seen it when you were doing your translation here, of the use of the word jade as a description. So there's the mentioning of the great Jade Emperor, and when children are born, they say they have jade-like features. And I'm wondering what you think this is. Is this for you a throwback to a deference to Chinese literature, maybe, this idea of describing things in terms of them being jade? I'm assuming it is it's not just a grand description, but a beautiful description to call someone jade-like.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. And I think, the ideas of the great Jade Emperor had filtered into Korean popular religion and culture. I'm not sure if they would even recognize them as necessarily being that Chinese, if that makes sense. But I think you're right that there is that kind of symbolism. And when you mention it, it's kind of curious, too, because the great Jade Emperor is a male figure. But I just did a word search for Jade on the PDF of the article, and it's interesting because it shows up when later on when the girls are reincarnated. There's this kind of connection drawn between them and flowers, and the flowers are kept in a jade vase, and the girls are described as jade. So I wonder if there's something with gender going on there too, but I think it's just jade is this beautiful gem, or I get a beautiful mineral. And maybe I'm trying to think, in Confucianism, isn't like our moral nature described as like a gem that we have to polish? I'm
gonna show my ignorance here of Confucianisan at the moment.
Was it like dodokul dagayo or something like that? Like to polish your virtue.
That does sound quite Confucian. I don't have the exact reference, but that does sound quite Confucian to my ear, actually, yes.
I think I think jade also has a moral quality. Like, it's not just that it's beautiful, but it's a kind of virtuous beauty.
So let's step from that virtuous beauty to what happens after. So let's get to the second daughter's death. What happens there? And so what happens with the second daughter, who is stuck, who begins to realize that her oldest sister was killed, and she's alone in the world?
Yeah. So, I mean, she eventually, she obviously feels really terrible about the loss of her sister. And to kind of go back, one thing I should mention about the way that Changhwa dies, she takes control because she actually jumps into the water herself.
Yes,
if I recall correctly.
I saw that. The sun was threatening to kill her, and then she says, "Don't worry, I've got this," kind of thing. And it's an odd moment. What did you make of that? As in, she just accepted. She didn't fight. It was just another young man trying to kill her, and she just accepts her death in some ways.
Yeah, I think a lot of that maybe goes back to this idea that, if a woman was in danger of sexual assault, there was this idea that she would commit suicide to prevent it, or to kill herself out of shame. And I think from our perspective today, that's really terrible. I think in the time period, though, perhaps from the woman's perspective, this is a way of asserting agency, of saying, I'm going to be in control here. I know my choices are limited, but at least I can do this myself. And I think that's maybe what it's trying to do, is to show just how brave and moral this woman was, and how strong she was, that she was willing to just say, okay, I'm going to do this myself, and I'm not going to let a man touch me, even if he's my step or half brother, rather. And it's interesting because it's really weird then how the younger sister dies, because she talks about how she hears the voice of her sister crying out from the mist. Like, she goes to the lake where her older sister had jumped in, right, rather than being thrown in, and it said the voice from within the mist calling to Hongnyon made her feel dizzy. She grasped her skirt in her right hand and then dove into the water as if she were flying. And so it's this weird, it's very eerie to me, because there's almost this idea that Changhwa is kind of beckoning her to come to her, and encouraging her little sister to kill herself.
Yeah, I read that. I have to admit, when I first read that, I had to pause and think, wait, did she just die? It was so sudden and so abrupt, and so almost natural to the reader that this was going to happen. And how did you see that? Because for me, it came across as in the same sense of the elder sister was disgraced, and that disgrace will pass on to the younger sister, so she can't bear to live. I'm not sure how you saw it.
I think that's a part of it, and I think also it's just their desire to be together. That in a sense, especially after their father's betrayal, I mean, they can't mention that explicitly, but they're all they had for each other after the father kind of abandoned them. And I think that's the part of it, just so they want to be together. And it's interesting that when they're reborn as twins rather than as, older, younger. Previously, there had been a separation. And one thing that's really a curious parallel is it talks about her grasping her skirt. So there's this idea that she's going in very carefully and very ladylike. And when her older sister, Changhwa, commits suicide, it talks about how she takes off her shoes and grabs her skirt. So there's this idea that they're fully in control, I think. That they're, even though they're emotionally upset, they haven't lost control, and they're asserting their bravery and their virtue in their manner of suicide.
Let's step into what happens after they die then. Because
okay, yeah.
One last question before we get into what is apparently the second part of this. So the story almost breaks into two halves here. So one last point here is that it has again these strong religious overtones. So both daughters die, and they talk about them being so embittered that they wander in the world, and it's almost a curse is pushed across the whole countryside. They talk about starvation and bad weather, and everything becomes desolate, and people are poor and sad. And it's again, it almost has a karmic element of something wrong has happened, so everyone in society must suffer for it.
Yeah, and I think, this is a society in which group punishment was normal. I can't remember the exact year, but it was during Choson, when I believe there was a son who slapped his father, and they punished the whole county. I think they wouldn't let them take the exams. And you see that kind of idea here was that something is morally out of balance, and it's a moral universe. So of course, when the crops aren't growing, when you've got these kinds of problems, there has to be something immoral that happened, especially when it's localized in like this one county. So we got to figure out what that was. And it's really striking. And it's definitely not an idea of like I say, this is not an individually oriented society, right? This is very group oriented. We're all suffering for this crime that we don't really even know about. Though it does seem like the girls' ghosts are hanging around talking to people, but no one seems to kind of catch on what's going on.
Well, they seem to be killing a lot of people by accident.
Right, well, that's true. Yeah,
Yes. So what happens?
The poor magistrates.
Yes. What happens to all these magistrates? Because again, it's casually slipped in there, but they keep appearing before the magistrates asking for help, and the magistrates are so scared that they keep dropping dead.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think in Korean folk belief there was this idea, right, that if a baby became ill, it was thought that maybe one of the ancestors, the spirit of the ancestor had like stroked the baby, was a ghost and like touched the baby, and that made the baby sick, because it's just not living people and dead people are different. We shouldn't touch each other. And I can't remember how to say it in Korean, but there's that saying, right? In an ancestor's touch, there's thorns. So you've got that kind of idea that it's kind of unhealthy for us to be around the dead. And for these two sisters who died very, violently and in these terrible circumstances, it's really unhealthy to be around them. Yes. And so it kills whoever shows up until we have the very, Magistrate Chong is willing to take on everything. And he almost dies, but he's able to, he talked about like he's able to hold his key in. He prevents his key from escaping him.
Well, let's do that then, because that's how the story changes at the end. So this is about halfway through. All this horrible stuff has happened, and then this one magistrate chooses to go to the village despite knowing all these horrible stories, and begins to investigate what happens. And he meets the ghosts, and then let's introduce this new magistrate and his role there, moving into the village, and what happens.
Yeah, all these people have been dying here. The counties, things are going wrong. And so this magistrate, or I'm sorry, this official named Chung Tong Ho, he volunteers and says, okay, I can do it. Please send me. And so the king shows his concern for the people, appoints Chung magistrate, and then sends him off. And so Chung says, okay, I hear that every time someone comes here, they die, like the first night. So he's like, okay, I'm going to get ready for this. And he told him to put all the lights on and to stay awake. And what I think is interesting is that he stays up reading the Book of Changes. And I wonder if that just indicates that somehow this guy, I mean, he's obviously a good Confucian official because he volunteered to take on this task for the good of the people. And of course, he can only become an official with Matt by, really knowing Confucianism well. But then this seems to show he has some kind of mystical knowledge, knowing about the Book of Changes well. But like I said, suddenly a chill wind blew without knowing why. He felt as if he was being pulled out of his body. And it seems like he was able, later we say the magistrate gathered his wits. So it's kind of like this idea, his spirit was being pulled out of him, but then he was able to kind of stuff it back in himself.
Yes.
And then he does that, and so now he can actually talk to the two sisters.
And one of the interesting things for me, they begin to tell their story to him about what happened. And this, for me, was, again, it has a lot of elements of the era to it. And when the sisters are complaining about what happened to them, they do speak about the way that they were framed and the way that they were, well, at least one of them was murdered. But they both say this at the same time. They both say, "We sisters grew up pretty and talented," and then laments, "Whenever there was an attempt to find spouses for us, our fierce stepmother, not just stepmother, became incredibly jealous. And so by the age of 20, we were not able to marry," which 20 would have been quite old back then.
Right.
So there's a real problem here of not being able to marry, and this is one of the fears that runs through all of this. Even with the husband who has his wife die, again, it's a constant fear of not being able to find a match and therefore not being able to find happiness as a result.
Yeah, I mean, this is a group-oriented society. It's interesting thing about like in other places, right? They could have just gone to a monastery, right? I mean, you could have had some kind of community, but Confucianism, dominant in Choson, they had suppressed Buddhism, so that's not really an option available. So you just can't make it alone. This is a society where you cannot really just live on your own. You have to be a member of a family and of a community, or else you're just going to be a social outcast, and your life is going to be very painful and short. So yeah, there's that pressure to marry. I mean, of course, if you don't get married, you won't have kids, and then who will take care of you when you get old. So I think there's definitely that pressure. And one thing, if I can, because it's something you said, you talked about how the sisters are giving this speech together. One thing we struggled with in translating this was sometimes it wasn't clear which sister was speaking, and we'd have these really long speeches, and it's like, I'm like, who's saying this? Or are they both saying this? Because that would be kind of weird to think of both sisters saying this at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And so I asked Sujin Lee, who along with Gillian Lee and Haesung Park gave me some assistance with this. And I asked her, I said, like, well, which sister is speaking? And her response was, does it matter?
It is interesting in that way. I mean, I've heard this a lot myself of the real problems with Korean to English translation is that you're reading for pages on pages and you don't know who's speaking. Yeah. And my first, I'm not sure, what's your instinct? My first instinct is, yeah, of course it matters who's speaking, but but perhaps not. No, I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, and in this part it was okay because she said, "I am Hongnyon, a daughter of Overseer Pei." But even that confused me because I'm like, why would the younger sister speak and not the older sister? What's going on here? But yeah, I think it's very important who's speaking. And I think plural and singular is very important, but Korean thinks differently. Yes,
absolutely. So the magistrate arrives. He hears the two girls' stories. He manages to not die like all the previous ones. And then he calls in. So he sees two ghosts that speak to him, and he believes them almost immediately, and he begins investigating. Right. So there's this feeling here that if you don't quite understand the times and the era, that it's hard to quite grasp. As in, two ghosts comes to him, and it's not as if he takes them as just as valid as another human being that's alive. It's almost like they're more valid because they are ghosts
Right.
and they are still lingering around. So they must have a grievance of some sort that's worth hearing.
Right. Well, and I'm sorry, I don't want to get too off topic, but during the crusade, the first crusade, outside, I think it was outside the walls of Jerusalem, there was this bishop who had played a very major role in reconciling the conflicting Crusader factions. But when by the time they got to Jerusalem, he had died. But then a priest claimed that his ghost had showed up to them and gave them instructions to basically fast and then march around the city of Jerusalem. And then later on, they were able to seize it by storm. So they said, okay, it must have been true. But someone made a YouTube video explaining this. And when that bishop appears, he has a word bubble that says, "I'm a ghost. You have to believe me."
Yes.
And that goes to exactly what you were saying, because there's this, right, yeah, it's like, can't a ghost lie? Yeah. Yes. It is kind of funny, too, because then they emphasize here, the story they're telling the magistrate's a little bit different. Because they didn't really mention that much about marriage so far. Right? It's kind of there. And I mean, I remember double checking that when we were translating. It's like, did I miss something? Yes. But yeah, she's kind of adding, they're giving the story a slight, I mean, I'm not trying to say they were lying, but they're giving the story a slightly different spin when they're talking to the magistrate. And, but you're exactly right. And this goes, I think, to that kind of moral or idea of a moral heaven. I mean, you can't become a vengeful ghost, apparently, unless you really have a good cause for vengeance.
Yes.
And it's funny because it's the idea of, like, I wonder what would happen if you had a murderer, he killed 10 people, but they hung him for the one person he didn't kill. And then he comes back for vengeance.
Yes.
A friend of mine came up with that idea. But.
Yeah, it's a similar thought. And it's also... It's almost like a moral authority here, because there's a tone here when the two girls are speaking to the magistrate, again unsure which girl it is exactly, but they're speaking, and the girl says here, please, all the things of please investigate my charge. I've been falsely accused, please look into it. And then there's a sentence that she says, which came across almost as a threat, it sounded like to me. It says, "If you do that, this town will be safe and enjoy peace." As in, if you don't investigate this, the horrors will continue forever. And it's a very authoritative moral tone that these sisters take.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they're the heroes. They're the moral. I think they're the only people in the story who really, except for the father's first wife who died, and then his last wife, the third wife, who was a very good, but it's hardly in the story. They're the only ones who are moral in a sense, other than the magistrate. And so, yeah, they're. And I wonder how much of that, I guess, is a threat, and how much is just saying that this is just the way the universe works. There has been an injustice done. The universe is out of harmony. It's a moral universe, and because the cause of the problem is inherently moral, unless you fix it, it's morally speaking, it's not going to go away. So I wonder if how much of it's a threat and how much of it's just a description of this is just the way things work.
So from that as well, let's begin to step this towards the grand conclusion here. And it begins, of course, with and this is an important spin, I think, on the story, as in the two daughters come to the magistrate, tell their story, and the magistrate immediately begins to investigate the story. And he brings in the husband and the new wife to speak to them. And he is deceived by the woman, by the wife. She tells a story about what happened, which just isn't true, and talks about the eldest daughter actually becoming pregnant and being a non-filial daughter and all these kind of things. And the two ghosts return, and they're exacerbated, saying, "You've been tricked by this cunning woman." And it's an odd turn that has to be put in the story, but I think, I'm not sure how you saw it, but for me, it was another way to reinforce and really keep there that anyone that thinks in this kind of way, who can think that quickly on their feet and be this cunning, must be an evil person, and this is a representation of it.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. about that. Yeah, all throughout, she's completely unrepentant, even when later on, when she's sentenced to death and should be saying, yes, I'm wrong, please have mercy on me, she's still lying. Like, it's really shocking how that works. And they just hit us over the head with how bad this woman is. And I just wonder, if she had read this story, would she have actually listened to the lesson?
Yes. Let's talk about the husband in this, because he is fascinating. And you put this in your analysis at the start, and this is worth thinking about. So eventually the magistrate figures it out. He brings them back in there. He investigates the case and realizes that they have been lied to. But there are two people here. One who faked the abortion, and a husband who happily put his daughter to death. And the husband gets exonerated throughout all of this. So the wife is killed. The son who blindly participated is killed. But the husband that plotted to have his daughter killed and agreed with it in cold blood is exonerated at the end of this, and in this extraordinary turn.
Right. Yeah. So I think there's a couple things going on there. One is his main crime is weakness, it seems. And so he realizes what he did was wrong. I think he says at one point that I deserve to die. Like, he realizes that what he did was really bad. And so he recognizes this. And I think that changes things in a sense, whereas Miss He never does that, right? She never has that moment where she says, what I did was wrong. And also, of course, is that I think Changhwa Hongnyon specifically said, please don't punish our father.
Yes.
And there's, of course, as we talked before, ghosts have a certain amount of credibility, apparently. And I think that's just how these things work, right? That in a sense we listen to ghosts, but Choson, and I apologize, I'm blanking on the name of the book, but there were cases where children would write like letters in blood asking that their parents be spared. And I remember, I think was it Lewis Lancaster? Someone had translated a bunch of cases from the time of Zhengzhou, where they reviewed death penalty cases. And in one of the cases, a man in a fit of anger hit his wife over the head with like a lamp, and it fractured her skull, and she died a short time later. But she had asked specifically that her husband be treated leniently. She said, I forgive my husband, please don't harm him. And so he was given a very light sentence. And so there was that idea that, in a sense, you could plead, and you would listen to someone's plea, with the idea being that only a good person would really plead. And if you have a good daughter, you must have been a good father. So he can't be totally bad, because if he was totally bad, how could you have daughters who were so good?
Yes.
So I think that's a big part of it. And, obviously they have a lot of sincerity. And of course, they're the victims. So the victims are saying, please don't punish our murderer. And I think that has a strong, what can I say, that has a lot of credibility when the victim is saying, please don't harm our father. And especially, they're being filial. Though curiously, that doesn't seem to help the Miss Ho, right? Because her two of her sons say, please let us suffer instead.
Yes. And her son is strangled to death. And
I
have some sympathy for their son. I'm not sure how you saw it. He's portrayed as a kind of a simpleton who just listens to his mum and does it. And then he follows his mum's order. This lion rips out his eye and his ears and his arm, and he's maimed for life. And then at the end, so the wife is eventually, and I'm going to quote here, it says, she is cut into pieces as a warning for others. And then it slips in there, and her son Chang So was strangled. And I think, did he need to be strangled? Was he not a filial son? Did he not obey his mother in the way he should have?
Well, I think that's maybe why he was strangled instead of being hacked to pieces. So
Yes.
because of course being hacked to pieces is the worst punishment, because then your body has been blemished, right? Which shows you're unfilial because you failed to protect the body your parents gave you. So Chong Sui, at least, being that he was strangled, at least he was able to preserve his body. But yeah, in a sense, I mean, I guess there's a couple things to say about that. One is that, yeah, I can't imagine a scenario where he could have possibly resisted his parents to their faces. Right? Like he had to say, I'll do it. Right? Like it's hard to imagine the Chosun being able to say to your parents, I'm not going to do this, which is why, I mean, they punished the whole family when someone did something really, really bad.
Yes.
But I'm thinking of, it's not, I think it's not Cinderella, I think it's Snow White, where you have the huntsman who is given the task of killing Snow White, but confronts her with the intent to kill her, but then realizes upon seeing her, this is really wrong, and tells her to run away. And then I think the huntsman kills a rabbit or something and gives the queen the rabbit's heart and says, okay, I killed Snow White. And then that allows Snow White to escape. And that's maybe what I guess is implied Chong Sui should have done. It's one thing to say, yes, I'll kill someone when you're being confronted in this hierarchical culture that emphasizes filial piety, when you're told, your sister did something really bad, you have to go kill her. Like, it's one thing to say yes, but then he's confronted with Changhwa, who's very sincere, very filial, says, we grew up as brother and sister, this isn't really right. And he still goes ahead and kills her anyway. And I think that kind of cements his bad character. Was if he was really good, then he would have been like the huntsman and said, you know what, you run away, go somewhere, get out of here, I'll tell them you're dead.
Yes. There's a theme, as you're saying that, there was something that was echoing in my ears here. I was looking at the text here, and there's almost like a flow here of the moral characters representing the moral world as a whole, as in, so the magistrate does this wonderfully moral act, and he discovers this injustice. So he kills the woman and the son, which is considered quite a moral act here. And then there's a monument erected for the two daughters. Again, something quite moral, you have to assume, in the scheme of this. But then there's this statement at the end of the magistrate. Then, after that month, he was gradually promoted and became commander-chief of the naval forces in the south. He grew with the result, yes. And it's almost like, of course, he does moral things and he is a moral character. And because of that, great moral things will come his way. As in, you're not going to suffer misfortune in this world if you are in line with this broadic, dharmic kind of universe.
Right, or we'll see, if you do suffer misfortune, eventually things will be resolved. Right, but yeah, I mean, there's this idea that if you're moral, good things happen to you. If you're not, bad things are going to happen to you eventually. Yes. And I think it's very, and that's one thing I try and have my students compare when I have them compare this to the movie, is the movie doesn't have such a nice ending. I mean, I don't want to spoil it, but here there is a moral universe that reasserts itself. There is, in a sense, healing, and I think that was very comforting to people in this time period. And of course, this was the translation we're working from. The version was from the colonial period, the Japanese colonial period, which I think people wanted some escapism into a moral universe. But yeah,
that is a really interesting thought, that idea of escapism. And you put that in your analysis here, that this is clearly a text that's made for Koreans of a certain era. So let's open up that question briefly before we do finish things here. That idea of this happened during the Japanese colonial period. And all the things that we've mentioned so far is this idea of huge moral injustice, but a moral universe which will eventually find its way towards right. And this appealing to escapist mindsets of Koreans during the Japanese colonial era.
Right, yeah. No, I think you summarized it very neatly there. I don't have a whole lot to add, but I think, there's something to that. And even one thing I try and tell my students, because it's weird, my specialty, like a lot of what I do research on, is on the anti-Catholic persecutions in the 19th century in Korea. and my students sometimes are a little confused because like I'm getting ready to teach a class on comics. I teach popular culture sometimes. They're like, what's going on here? And I'm like, well, what I study is so darn depressing.
Yes.
I need some escapism. And so that's one reason I really like this story, and why the bird is my favorite part, because it is this wonderful, nice kind of moral universe. Bad things may happen, but eventually it'll all work out.
Yes. Let's step it into the final phase here. So they're all. So this all happens. Magistrate leaves, and it's almost slipped in there without consciously explaining why. That this husband, completely unshaken by his last two marriages, remarries again. So before he could only get this horrible, ugly woman, and now suddenly he's getting this young. She's 18 years old, I believe. And I'm going to quote, and suddenly she has, in appearance and virtue, she is extraordinary, and she's gentle, and she's wise, and she's happy, and all this. And you think to yourself, suddenly his fortunes have changed around. He must be an old man by now, and he's marrying this beautiful 18-year-old girl full of virtue. It's a complete turnaround for the husband in terms of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a strong point for the story. I think in terms of structure, it's like, how did this happen? Yes. The only thing I would also add, I think it's fascinating that the original had it. She was gentle by nature and wise. So, I guess the problem was she hadn't been born yet. Miss Ha was apparently, because the age difference. I mean, Choson was older, so this woman, she's only 18, so she wouldn't have been born yet when he married Miss Ha, the second evil wife. So. I guess that's how I can try and explain it plot-wise, but it's really weird because now apparently he hit the jackpot.
Yes. So I, as a last question, I might get to open out the story, what happens thereafter, because of course he remarries, and then there's a twist at the end, which I didn't see coming myself, which again is about moral rectitude and righteousness. And so the two daughters, so the new wife gets pregnant, she has twins, and she has two daughters. And again, it's this divine intervention from God and all these kinds of things, and the universe. And it's how do you read that last turn? As in, it wasn't enough for the ghosts of the two daughters just to be happy and to save themselves from this life of agony. They actually were reborn.
Right, yeah, and I think that's where Buddhism comes in, but it's a kind of folk Buddhism. And I think it's because, and this again is where the Confucianism comes in a sense too, that this world that's the real deal, right? It's this world that's what's important. So, if you get justice and then you just go to heaven, I mean, hey, that's great. But that's for a different kind of culture, right? Here, I think the idea is that, okay, they got vengeance, but is that really a happy ending? You missed out on everything that makes a good life. So I think that's a big part of this, and why maybe this was, this is a big expansion, I think, on the 17th century version. I'm not sure when this part was added, but that they add all this about how they have these wonderful lives, they have long lives, they have a bunch of kids, they have great husbands. And I think it's because of that focus in Confucian. I mean, like I say, it's complex because they're using a Buddhist idea, but it's following this Confucian focus on this world. That in order for it to be a truly happy ending, they have to enjoy all the virtuous pleasures of this world. And in that happy ending, literally the very last paragraph here in the novel, it stops and dips into very explicit moral teaching here, as in almost like a moral lecture you might get at a university here. It starts with, I'm going to quote here, so it finishes and all the families are happy. The two reincarnated daughters, of course, marry very virtuous husbands who go on to do wonderful things. And then it starts, the last paragraph starts with this: in this world, the 3 bonds and the 5 relationships are the most important. And so what is that a reference to, and why do they drop it in there at the very end here? Right. I mean, yeah, this is the didactic part. This is, of course, a reference to Confucian ideals. I mean, the 3 bonds are the ruler, subject, parent, child, husband, wife. And, of course, the 5 relationships. I mean, those are a little bit longer, so I won't, but they're similar kind of ideas. But But yeah, it's an attempt in a sense to harness folk religion and belief to Confucian ends. Right, that this is a moral universe. There's all this kind of supernatural stuff going on, but it essentially serves the moral vision of Confucianism, and we need to consider this because if we don't act well, if we act like Mrs. He, then things are going to go bad for us. But it's interesting too because on one side, even though it's very Confucian, there's a kind. I guess I'm being kind of unfair. Let me backtrack for a second. I think it's very interesting because we tend to think, the five relations, three bonds are very hierarchical, and they really focus on the idea of obedience to the one who's on top in the relationship. But in Confucianism, there's also this idea that you have to, you owe people on top respect, but they owe you benevolence back. And I think that's the idea here, right? Heaven's retaliation is like this: good is repaid with good, and evil with evil. If you're the parent of someone else's child, keep this in mind. So don't abuse your position.
Yes.
Right? You're supposed to use that. You're treated with respect and authority, and you have a position of authority, but you have to use that for the good of the child. And you have to be sensitive to these kids. I mean, Miss He was not, and she let how much happier would she have been if she just would have been nice?
Yes.
Because the daughters, I mean, the daughters would have been respectful to her too. I mean, there's no indication that they weren't. But yeah, that's. I mean that I maybe veered a little bit away from what you were asking.
Your last quote there was important. So the very last sentence, you quoted it there. If you are a parent of someone else's child, keep this in mind. It comes across as a very explicit threat of sorts, as in.
Oh right, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and sorry, go.
Oh no, I mean, yeah, I think you're right, and I don't know. I mean, this gets tricky because I think about. I've always. It's kind of like how the teachings in Buddhism, it's not like a threat. It's it just is explaining how the world works. If I tell my children, don't run out into the street because you'll get hit by a car. It's not that I'm threatening them. I'm just saying, cars go down that street, and this can happen. So I think it's just describing that we live in a moral universe. Bad things will happen to you if you don't go along with it, and. Hopefully, eventually, we'll get free from Japanese colonialism.
Yes. Well, as a final look back on this text, it was a few years ago now that you did this this translation. And of course, you've been teaching it ever since. So this is a final thought to sum up what we've been through here. How do you look back on this story and this text over time? And how should people, in your opinion, look back on it? Of course, it's called the Korean Cinderella story, but
right.
I wonder if you agree with that label, or is this just a convenient way to sell the story, and how you see it after these years and teaching it and being so heavily involved in it?
Sure. Well, just real quick, I want to stress for your listeners, of course, I did have help with this. Like, I was the main translator, but there were several people, my former student, Sujin Lee, who helped originally with it. And then another Lander professor, Dr. Gillian Lee, who's in computer science, he helped me with a few difficult passages, and then there was some stuff he had trouble with, so we sent it to Hae-Sung Pak, and she helped us. I have to, I don't want the listeners to think I'm a better translator.
Yes,
I have a lot of assistance. But I think the first thing I would say is to just enjoy it. I mean, just have fun with it. I think this story was written to be enjoyed, and I enjoyed translating it. Like, I really looked forward to sitting down. And sometimes I would get translated and I didn't want to stop. Like, I had other things I had to do, or it was like, time to eat dinner. And it's like, oh, I don't want to stop. This is so much fun, this story. So I hope that people will just enjoy it. And of course, also think about the deeper issues involved. I think it's helpful to people who aren't familiar with it to refer to it as a Korean Cinderella. My only concern with doing that is just I don't want to take away from the Koreans. It's sort of like when people say, that Admiral Lee Sun-shin is the Korean Horatio Nelson.
Yes.
And as a historian, I have to say, well, but Lee Sun-shin was first.
Yes.
So it should be the other way around, right? So, I think it's a good comparison, but I think the story can stand on its own, right? I don't want that to be understood as to be like, oh, this is just a Korean version of something that's, like the Western is the real version. It's not like that. This is awesome, I think.
Yes.
The students really got into it. They really enjoyed, and I guess for our listeners, if any of you are teaching, I was really happy with how this assignment went, where we watched the Two Sisters in Class. And I apologize, maybe I can find the bibliography. Someone wrote a really good analysis of the movie. It's So Jong Nam in Acta Koreana 2011 wrote an analysis of the movie because sometimes students are easily disturbed by horror movies. So you can have a student who feels too nervous to watch a movie. You can assign them to read that article because it explains the movie. And they really got into the comparison. And the assignment was really simple. It was just, explain what stayed the same and explain what changed. Because what stays the same tells us something about Korean culture that's very, very essential. Right? That this seems to have endured hundreds of years, whereas things that change tell us how Korea has transformed. And the students really got into it. And it was interesting which one they preferred. And I had that question, which do you like better, the story or the movie? I enjoyed both, but I had to say I really like the story better. Because I love this idea of this magical universe where lions talk and friendly birds guide us around.
Well, that's a great note to leave the podcast on. So, of course, the story we've been speaking about today through translation is the story of Changhwa and Hongnyon. And, of course, I'm going to link it below along with a link to Frank's academic profile. You can go and see for yourself. And I do encourage you to read through it and to read through the story. It really is a fascinating look into Korean life and the era that it came about from. So, on that, Frank Rausch, thanks for coming on the Korean Art Podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Korean Art Podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.